The story begins. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land.
And so Elimelech and his wife Naomi and their 2 sons, Mahlon and Chilion, leave Bethlehem and go to Moab in search of a better life. Then Elimelech dies, and Naomi's sons marry 2 Moabite women, Ruth and Orpah. And then tragedy strikes, and they both die, leaving 3 widows with no way to support themselves.
So before we go on, a word about Moab, because this is really important for understanding the rest of the story. Moab and Israel were enemies. They did not like each other at all. When the 12 tribes of Israel were leaving Egypt and traveling through the wilderness to the promised land, they camped in Moab. And there's a reference in Deuteronomy 23 to a request made by the tribes of the Moabites, or to the Moabites, for bread and water. They were hungry and they were thirsty. But Israel had a reputation for just kind of sucking up all the resources they came across. So the Moabites refused their request. Israel never forgot that slight. In fact, in Deuteronomy, the law states that an Egyptian, remember the Egyptians enslaved them for 400 years, the Egyptians could be forgiven, and the 3rd generation of their children could then become part of the people of God. Moabites, however, shall never be admitted to the people of God, not even if over 10 generations they prove themselves faithful, because they did not show hospitality to Israel in their time of need. And there's another piece to this also. Moabite women were considered dangerous. In Numbers, there's a story told of how sexually voracious Moabite women led the poor Israelite men astray. And of course, I don't feel sorry for those men if they were that weak. That's my own little commentary there. Anyway, so what ended up happening, though, was because Israel didn't want their purity compromised by the gods of other countries, they attacked Moab because their women were leading the Israelite men astray. They attacked and defeated Moab and killed quite a number of them. So for Elimelech and Naomi to go to Moab during a famine, and then for Naomi to actually let her sons marry Moabite women would have been a scandal.
So when Naomi heard the famine was over in Bethlehem, she set out to return to her homeland. She tried to send Ruth and Orpah back to their mothers in hopes that their families would find new husbands for them. Orpah at first sticks with Naomi, but finally gives in. Ruth doesn't. This is where Ruth famously says, "Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will become my people, and your God, my God." So Naomi and Ruth moved to Bethlehem. That's where we pick up the story.
Now Naomi had a kinsman on her husband's side, a prominent rich man of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain behind someone in whose sight I may find favor." So she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she went. She came and gleaned in the field behind the reapers. As it happened, she came to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech.
Just then Boaz came from Bethlehem. He said to the reapers, "The Lord be with you." They answered, "The Lord bless you." Then Boaz said to his servant who was in charge of the reapers, "To whom does this young woman belong?" The servant who was in charge of the reapers answered, "She is the Moabite who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab." She said, "Please let me glean and gather amongst the sheaves beyond the reapers." So she came, and she's been on her feet from early this morning until now, without resting for even a moment.
Then Boaz said to Ruth, "Now listen, my daughter, do not go to glean in another field or leave this one, but keep close to my young women. Keep your eyes on the field that is being reaped and follow behind them. I have ordered the young men not to bother you. If you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn."
Then she fell prostrate with her face to the ground and said to him, "Why have I found favor in your sight that you should take notice of me when I'm a foreigner?"
Boaz answered her, "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told me, and how you left your father and mother in your native land and came to a people that you did not know before. May the Lord reward you for your deeds, and may you have a full reward from the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge."
Ruth continues to glean until the end of the harvest season, at which time Ruth and Naomi need to figure out where their next meal will come from. We pick up the story again in chapter 3.
Naomi said to Ruth, "My daughter, I need to seek some security for you, so that it may be well with you. Now here is our kinsman Boaz, with whose young women you have been working. See, he is winnowing barley tonight at the threshing floor. Now wash and anoint yourself, put on your best clothes, and go down to the threshing floor, but do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, observe the place where he lies. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down, and he will tell you what to do."
Ruth does as Naomi said. She laid down next to Boaz, who was probably a little drunk by then. And when he woke up at midnight, he was startled to see a woman lying there. So he said, "Who are you?" And she answered, "I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are next of kin."
By the way, that whole spreading the cloak over your servant was actually a marriage proposal. That was one of the traditions for how marriage was proposed in ancient Israel. And by reminding Boaz that he was next of kin, she was claiming the right to levirate marriage, which we learned about when we talked about with Tamar. The closest next of kin to Mahlon had the responsibility to marry Ruth, father a child, a son, by her, who would carry on Mahlon's name. Ruth dared to claim that right, even though she was from Moab, and it was forbidden for an Israelite to marry someone from Moab.
Boaz said, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. This last instance of your loyalty is better than the first. You have not gone after young men, whether poor or rich. And now, my daughter, do not be afraid. I will not do for you all that you ask, for all the assembly of my people know that you are a worthy woman. But now, though it's true that I am a near kinsman, there is another kinsman more closely related than I. Remain this night, and in the morning, if he will act as next of kin for you, good, let him do so. If he's not willing to act as next of kin for you, then as the Lord lives, I will act as next of kin for you." A word of God that is still speaking.
Thanks be to God. I forgot to write down who was saying that. Well,
It said one, I'm not sure.
we got it covered. So, we have heard the story of Ruth 1,000 times, but there's another story we have also heard 1,000 times. It's a story of famine, of war, of gang violence, of corrupt governments that persecute their citizens. People desperate to do whatever they need to do to secure a better future for themselves. So they pack up whatever they can carry. They leave behind the only homes they have ever known. In many cases, they cross borders to lands they've never been to, where they don't even know the language. But they carry with them the belief and the hope that surely where they are going will be better than where they were. I know in our own congregation, this is not just a story. This is the life you have lived. We have folks in our church who have said, "It is not safe for me where I was. Let me go find a better place." And they took incredible risks. Many of you have taken incredible risks to do that. These are people who have names like Jose, and Jamal, and Kwame, and Naomi, and Ruth. The book of Ruth is one that I think when most of us hear it, we think about this, a love story. The words that Ruth said to Naomi about, "I am never going to leave you. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your God will be my God." It is a love story. It's also the story of King David's origins. Remember, we're talking about Ruth because she is one of the 4 women mentioned in Jesus' genealogy. She is the grandmother of King David, one of the greatest kings in the Israelite story there. That's how most of us know this book. That's how most of us have heard about this story over the years. But it is also the story of an immigrant family looking for a better life for themselves. They lived, ironically enough, in Bethlehem during a famine. And Bethlehem means house of bread, and they had no bread. And so they went to find a better life for themselves. They were trying to survive in the midst of a really bad famine. It's a story of survival. It's also a story of grace. And grace, it comes from a very unexpected place. And you might have missed it, if you've read the book recently, because it happens just like in the first couple verses. It comes from the Moabites, the enemies of the Israelites. Elimelech, Naomi, and her 2 sons traveled to Moab in search of food. They crossed that invisible border beyond which no one from either side should ever go. No one would have blinked had the Moabites looked at this young family and said, "Sorry, we got nothing for you." In fact, nobody would have blinked had the Moabites killed them, because the hatred between these 2 people was that strong. But instead of turning away a family in need, the Moabites opened up their homes to them. They let them come in and establish their own homes. They married their daughters to their sons, the Moab daughters to the Israelite sons. And they, in essence, said, "You are family now." We miss that part of the story, don't we, when we read it? The grace and the generosity and the hospitality that the Moabites offered this young family. But when Naomi and Ruth returned to Bethlehem, after the famine was over, 10 years away, a long famine, it was a very different story. First, there was gossip. Isn't that Naomi? Didn't she abandon us 10 years ago when the famine hit? And then there was the othering, specifically the othering of Ruth. Did you notice in the portions of the reading that Sherry and I just did this morning how many times Ruth was not just Ruth? She was Ruth the Moabite. And several times she was just the Moabite. 2 words put her in a stereotype, boxed her in, and said, "We really have no clue who you are, but you are one of them. Not even worthy of a name." She was the one who would not help Israel when they were hungry and thirsty in the wilderness. She was the one whose beauty and guile led those weak Israelite men astray. She was the Moabite. She was not one of us. And as such, they actually had no responsibility to her. The people of Bethlehem had no responsibility to her. Naomi did not fare much better. Even though Bethlehem was Naomi's home, no one stepped up to help her either, not even her own family. Isn't that sad? Isn't that sad that the hated outsiders showed more hospitality than the people of God? Things have flipped. This is a story of immigration that gets played out all over the world. The book of Ruth in Jewish tradition is read in its entirety, all 4 chapters, during the feast of Shavuot. Shavuot celebrates the giving of the law at Mount Sinai. And the law was quite clear about 2 things. First thing, the stranger who resides with you shall be treated as one of your own citizens. You shall love them as you love yourself, because you were once strangers in the land of Egypt. The Torah lays out that basic tenet 36 times more than any other teaching. You shall treat the foreigner among you as one of your own. And of course, in the Gospels, Jesus not only echoes this command, but he self-identifies with the stranger. He says, "For I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me." This is the primary way we are all called to live out our calling as the people of God. So first, the law was very clear. Welcome the immigrant, because that was you at one time. And the law was equally clear on the second thing, which is, accept the Moabites, because they did not help you when you were hungry. Don't mistreat the immigrants who are living among you, except the Moabites. Grudges don't die easily, do they? Except then there's Ruth. Ruth was the hated Moabite. She was ostracized. She was actually left to fend for herself by picking up what was left over in the fields after the harvesters were done. It was a job that only the most desperate would do. They put their safety at risk because where would you find most of the grain left behind? It would be in the hard-to-get places, which were the gullies, they were the washes, they were the places that were out of sight. You took the risk of being attacked and having what little you have gleaned stolen by others who were as desperate as you were, and women were at risk of being raped. That was what you did if you had no other options. And that's what Ruth did. But then something remarkable happened. Boaz noticed her. And he tells his hired hands not to lay a hand on her. And he tells them, leave some extra grain for her when she's behind you. In fact, he told them to leave so much that she would actually collect in one day more than those hired hands would make in a month. And when Ruth asks Boaz, why was he doing that for her, a foreigner, the answer was simple. He learned her story. He learned what she had done for Naomi. He heard of her loyalty and her kindness, what she gave up to leave her home and come to Bethlehem. Ruth was no longer the Moabite. She was Ruth with a story. Isn't it amazing how things change when we learn someone's story? The stereotype goes right out the window. So we have then the letter of the law, and we have the spirit of the law. The letter of the law allowed Israel to other the Moabites and treat them as less than human. After all, the Moabites really weren't real people. They were this fictionalized character that they remembered from generations past. But when faced with a real live human being, the letter of the law fails because you're not dealing with a nameless stereotype anymore. You're talking to Ruth. And you have to get to know Ruth. And that requires you to set aside those stereotypes. Get to know someone's story. Get to know their needs. And then it's a lot easier to respond with compassion and with kindness instead of judgment, with love instead of hate, with inclusion instead of exclusion. Ruth's story ended well because someone recognized that she was a human being and not other. Here's another immigrant's story, a little bit more current. In 2022, Wilson Velasquez, his wife and 3 children, fled gang violence in Honduras. And yes, they did cross illegally into the United States, but as soon as they did, they turned themselves over to Border Patrol and requested asylum. They were given permission to work, they were given a court date, and Wilson was also given an ankle bracelet. 5 weeks ago, on Sunday, January 26th, immigration agents showed up at a church in Georgia and arrested him in the middle of worship. The ICE agents admitted they were not specifically looking for people with criminal arrest records. They were just looking for anyone with an ankle bracelet, which meant they really weren't looking for Wilson. They were looking for illegals. And of course, that term is itself a way of just othering people because it is not illegal to be a human being. Human beings do illegal things, but human beings are not illegal. By the way, that event, if you've been watching the news, is one reason our denomination has joined a lawsuit against the federal government. trying to overturn the executive order that overturned a longstanding policy that immigration actions won't be enforced in schools or in hospitals or in churches. Any of you know where that came from, that policy? Back in the 1980s, y'all remember the sanctuary movement? Some of you familiar with that? A few heads are nodding there. Back in the 1980s, the government sent spies into Southside Presbyterian Church in Tucson, Arizona, to gather intelligence against their pastor, Pastor John Fife, and the leaders of that church, because that church was providing aid over the course of about 10 years to some 15,000 Central American refugees fleeing death squads in their hometown. And so the government sent in spies to get information so they could arrest them all. And after that, the backlash was so strong that an internal policy was made that, we aren't going to do that for churches, hospitals, or schools. We are at a point where we have to ask, what does our faith require of us? It's one thing to make a blanket statement and say, we don't want refugees just pouring into our country. But what about Ruth? What if she and Naomi were to show up on your doorstep and ask for help? What would you do? What if it were her whole family with her 2 young sons fleeing famine? What would you do? Would you treat them as illegal immigrants and turn them in, or would you give them something to eat? Would you embrace the call of Deuteronomy, which tells us to treat the foreigner, the stranger in our midst, as one of us? Would you see Jesus in them and feed them? At our session retreat, we had a long conversation about whether our church should be saying anything in response to what's happening in our country right now. And we knew full well, even as we were having this conversation, that it was going to make a lot of people uncomfortable, including perhaps some of us sitting around that table having that conversation. Might be venturing too far into politics. Will it put our tax-exempt status at risk? And because I know now that I've mentioned that, some of you are now wondering, will that put our tax-exempt status at risk? Unless if you were me, I'd be wondering about that too. As long as we're not campaigning for or against a particular candidate or engaging in lobbying efforts to the point that it's a significant part of our activities, the IRS actually says we're okay. So at the moment, we're okay. But within those limits, and we should probably ask whether we should let the IRS define the limits of how we live out our faith, but within those limits, if our faith doesn't move us to speak out on behalf of those values that are a part of our faith, if it doesn't move us to speak out against those things that diminish life or that harm those who have the least ability to take care of themselves, what right do we have to speak about anything? If our faith stays quiet when people are silenced, when injustice is plainly seen, or when the most needy among us, citizen or foreigner, is kicked while they're down, then we have failed to live into our calling to be Christ's light in the world. At our session retreat, we ultimately agreed that as a church, one of whose core values is all are loved, we agreed we do have something to say. And people are hungering to hear the church stand up and say something. Because love is not contingent on someone's immigration status. Love is a verb, it requires action. Because of love, Jesus gave up his life for us. Because we are called to love the foreigner as we love each other. Because whenever we see someone in need, we are seeing Jesus. Because it's what love does. We have a voice. What are we called to say? Let's remember that the power behind that voice is not our own, it's Jesus Christ, who never saw anyone as an other. He always saw the person behind the stereotype, and he loved that person. And he did whatever love required for that person. I know it can be daunting to contemplate what love requires of us as we look at this whole big picture surrounding the immigration issues in our country. I am grateful for everyone who's trying to figure that out, even if I don't necessarily agree with them, because I don't have the answer. But I'm also grateful for those who are willing to stand up and say, we have to do better. There is a better way. Even if we don't know what it is, there is a better way and a more humane way of treating each other. And I'll just add, immigrant or not. I'm also grateful for Ruth's story, because it reminds us that for every them, there's a Ruth. And when we stop seeing the stereotype and really see the person, we do see Jesus. So I'm just going to leave you with a few questions, because ultimately each one of us has to decide what we are called to do and how we will live out that calling. So I will just leave you with these questions. Who have you stereotyped? Who have you othered? Whose story do you need to learn? And what does love require of you? What does love require of us? Amen.